January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. The tropical sun hammered down on the tarmac as Major Frank McCoy circled the aircraft in silence. His team from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit had examined dozens of wrecked Japanese planes across the Pacific. Twisted metal, charred wreckage pulled from jungle floors, bullet-riddled fuselages dragged out of shallow lagoons. But this was different. This bomber was intact, completely intact. A Mitsubishi G4M, the aircraft the Allies called Betty, abandoned by its crew during the American advance on Clark Field. No crash damage, no fire scarring, every rivet in place. Tail number 763-12. It sat on the concrete like a museum exhibit, its distinctive cigar-shaped fuselage gleaming as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. McCoy climbed a ladder and opened the wing inspection panels, and what he found inside made him stop breathing for a moment. He turned to his lead engineer and said 5 words that would be quoted in intelligence reports across 3 continents. No Air Force would build this. The fuel tanks, all 8 of them, 4 in each wing, holding thousands of liters of high-octane aviation gasoline, were completely naked. No self-sealing rubber lining, no armor plating, no fire suppression of any kind, nothing between thousands of liters of fuel and enemy bullets, but a thin sheet of aluminum, maybe 2 millimeters thick, about the width of a nickel. By 1945, every single American combat aircraft, from heavy bombers to single-seat fighters, featured self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. It was considered as essential as wings. The idea that a frontline bomber, produced in the thousands, flown in every major battle of the Pacific War, would carry unprotected fuel was not just surprising. It was incomprehensible. But here was the thing that truly shook McCoy and his team over the next 3 weeks as they dismantled that bomber piece by piece. Those naked fuel tanks were not an accident. They were not a shortcut. They were not a manufacturing deficiency caused by wartime shortages. They were a deliberate engineering decision made 8 years earlier by some of the brightest aeronautical minds in Japan. A calculated trade that purchased extraordinary range and speed at a price that Western military doctrine considered unthinkable: the lives of every single man who flew the aircraft. The Betty bomber could fly farther than any bomber on Earth. It could strike targets that no other aircraft could reach. It sank battleships, devastated air bases, and projected Japanese air power across distances spanning half the Pacific Ocean. And it burned. It burned like nothing American pilots had ever seen. 2 or 3 bullets anywhere near the wing, and the aircraft erupted into a fireball. No wounded bombers limping home. No emergency landings with half a wing missing. Just fire. Instant, total, catastrophic fire. American fighter pilots gave it nicknames that spread through every squadron in the Pacific. The Flying Lighter, the One-Shot Lighter, the Flying Zippo, the Flying Cigar. Every name referenced the same terrifying reality. Hit this bomber anywhere, and it dies. So how do you end up building the most important bomber in your arsenal, knowing that it will kill its own crews as efficiently as it kills the enemy? How does the longest-ranged bomber in the world become the most vulnerable? How does the aircraft that opened the Pacific War by destroying American air power end up, 4 years later, carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white paint and green crosses? To answer those questions, we need to go back to 1937, to a set of requirements written by the Imperial Japanese Navy that were so extreme, so demanding, that the engineers who received them knew immediately. Meeting these specifications would require a sacrifice that no Western Air Force would ever accept, and they made that sacrifice anyway. What follows is the story of what that decision cost. Part 1. The Impossible Equation. September 1937. The offices of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagoya, Japan. A document arrived from the Imperial Japanese Navy containing specifications for a new twin-engine land-based attack bomber. The engineers who read it must have exchanged glances across the drafting table, because what the Navy was asking for bordered on fantasy. Top speed, 398 kilometers per hour. Cruising altitude, 3,000 meters. And here was the number that changed everything. Range, 4,722 kilometers without weapons. 3,700 kilometers carrying an 800-kilogram torpedo, or the equivalent weight in bombs. Let me put those numbers in perspective for you. In 1937, no bomber anywhere on Earth could do what the Japanese Navy was demanding. The American B-17 Flying Fortress, which would become the backbone of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, had a maximum range of roughly 3,200 kilometers in its early variants. And that was without bombs. The British Wellington, one of the most capable bombers in Europe at the time, could manage around 2,500 kilometers. The Japanese Navy was asking Mitsubishi to build a medium bomber that could outrange every heavy bomber on the planet. But these numbers were not arbitrary. They were not some admiral's ego trip scrawled on a napkin. They were calculated with surgical precision based on the distances that defined Japan's strategic reality. Think about the map of the Pacific for a moment. From the Japanese bases on Formosa to the American air bases in the Philippines, roughly 750 kilometers. From Rabaul, Japan's fortress in the South Pacific, to Guadalcanal, where the decisive Battle of the Pacific would eventually be fought, over 1,000 kilometers. From Japanese home islands to potential targets scattered across millions of square kilometers of open ocean, thousands of kilometers of empty water with nothing in between. Japan's empire was built on islands separated by vast stretches of Pacific. Their navy needed an aircraft that could leap across those distances, strike targets that the enemy considered safely beyond reach, and return home. Aircraft carriers could project air power, but carriers were vulnerable and expensive. Land-based bombers operating from island airfields could provide constant coverage across the entire theater, day after day, without risking a single ship. The bomber that could meet these specifications would give Japan a capability that no other nation possessed. Strategic reach that could cover the Pacific from one edge to the other. The problem was physics. The man tasked with solving this equation was Kairo Honjo, the chief designer at Mitsubishi's aircraft division. Honjo was no novice. He had studied aeronautical engineering at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, one of the most advanced aircraft manufacturers in Europe. He understood European design philosophy intimately. He knew how Western engineers approached the problem of building combat aircraft, and he understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements using Western methods was flatly impossible. Here is where the mathematics become brutal. Let me walk you through the engineering problem that Honjo faced, because understanding this math is the key to understanding everything that follows. Aviation fuel weighs approximately 0.8 kilograms per liter. To achieve the range the Navy demanded, the new bomber needed roughly 4,780 liters of fuel. That is 3,824 kilograms of fuel weight alone, nearly 4 metric tons just in gasoline. Now, a twin-engine bomber of this size, with the power plants available in 1937, the Mitsubishi Kase radial engine producing 1,530 horsepower each, could lift a maximum takeoff weight of roughly 9,500 kilograms. Subtract the fuel weight, 3,824 kilograms. That left approximately 5,676 kilograms for literally everything else: the airframe, the engines, the propellers, the landing gear, the instruments, the weapons, the defensive armament, the crew of 7, and their protection. Protection was where the numbers fell apart. Self-sealing fuel tanks, the kind that every American bomber carried as standard equipment, used layers of rubber compound sandwiched between the fuel cell and the aircraft structure. When a bullet punctured the tank, fuel would contact the rubber, causing it to swell and seal the hole. Brilliant technology, absolutely essential for crew survival, and heavy. Adding self-sealing compound to 8 fuel tanks of this size would add roughly 300 to 400 kilograms. Armor plating around pilot seats, crew positions, and critical systems, the standard configuration in American bombers like the B-17, added another 300 to 500 kilograms, depending on coverage. Fire suppression systems, redundant fuel lines, armored bulkheads to prevent fire from spreading between compartments. All of it added weight. The cumulative cost of adequate crew protection exceeded 800 kilograms by conservative estimates. Some calculations pushed it over 1,000, and here was the trap. Every kilogram devoted to protection was a kilogram stolen from fuel capacity. Every kilogram of rubber sealant and steel plate reduced range. Honjo's engineers ran the numbers again and again, and every calculation arrived at the same conclusion. A fully protected bomber could not achieve the Navy's range specifications, not with 1937 technology, not with the engines available, not without making the aircraft so heavy that it would fail to meet speed requirements, or so fuel-limited that it would fall thousands of kilometers short of the range target. The choice was binary: build an aircraft that met the Navy's performance requirements but could not protect its crew, or build an aircraft that protected its crew but could not meet the Navy's requirements. Remember that detail, because this is the decision that would echo across every battle of the Pacific War. Honjo chose performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected. No self-sealing rubber, no armor plating around fuel cells, no fire suppression systems beyond basic handheld extinguishers. Every gram of weight saved would be reinvested into fuel capacity and structural efficiency. Now, before you judge that decision, understand the context in which it was made. The year was 1937. Japan had been fighting in China since July of that year, and the air war over China had taught Japanese military planners specific lessons that shaped their thinking. Japanese bombers in China, particularly the G-3M Nell, the Betty's predecessor, had operated with relative impunity. Chinese air opposition was limited and disorganized. Japanese formations flew high and fast, delivered their bombs, and returned home largely untouched. Losses were minimal. The lesson that Japanese planners drew from this experience was that speed, altitude, and surprise provided all the protection a bomber needed. If you could fly faster than enemy fighters, higher than anti-aircraft guns, and farther than anyone expected, you did not need armor. You needed performance. This assumption was reinforced by a broader strategic calculation. Japanese planners believed that any future Pacific War would be short. They assumed that a rapid series of devastating strikes, destroying enemy air and naval power in the first weeks, would force a negotiated settlement. The war would be measured in months, not years. Under this timeline, the enemy would never have the opportunity to build up fighter strength sufficient to challenge Japanese bomber formations in sustained combat. Every single one of these assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong, but in September 1937, they were the accepted wisdom of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and Honjo designed his aircraft accordingly. The first G-4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The test pilot was Katsuzoshima, and the results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Speed surpassed the Navy's requirements. Range demolished them. The aircraft could fly over 6,000 kilometers, farther than any bomber in service anywhere on the planet. Payload capacity met every operational need. The bomber was everything the Navy had asked for and more. Production began immediately. The first operational G-4M1 Model 11 rolled off the Mitsubishi assembly line in Nagoya in April 1941. By December of that year, approximately 180 G-4Ms were in service with Japanese Navy air groups scattered across the Pacific. These aircraft were about to demonstrate exactly what Honjo's design philosophy could achieve when every assumption behind it held true. And then they were about to demonstrate what happened when those assumptions shattered. But the Betty's first 12 months of combat would look like vindication. Complete, devastating, undeniable vindication. The aircraft performed exactly as designed, striking targets at ranges no enemy expected, with results that stunned military observers around the world. What happened in those first months would convince Japanese commanders that they had built the perfect weapon. They had not. They had built a magnificent aircraft with a fatal flaw engineered into its DNA, and the bill for that flaw was about to come due in a currency measured not in yen or dollars, but in the lives of thousands of young men who climbed into those unprotected bombers and never came home. But to understand how high that bill would climb, we first need to see the Betty at its absolute best. We need to see what this aircraft could do when everything went right, because the tragedy of the G4M is not that it failed. The tragedy is that it succeeded brilliantly, just long enough to guarantee that thousands more would be built with the same fatal vulnerability. And by the time the truth became undeniable, it was far too late to change course. Part 2. The Glory and the Reckoning. December 8th, 1941. Formosa, now Taiwan. The morning was thick with tension. Hours earlier, Japanese aircraft had devastated the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now it was the Philippines' turn, and the weapon that would deliver the blow was the Betty bomber, 107 G4Ms from the 1st Kokutai and Kanoya Kokutai, organized under the 21st Air Flotilla, prepared for launch from bases on Formosa. Their target, Clark Field, the primary American air base in the Philippines, home to the largest concentration of American air power in the Western Pacific. There was a problem. Fog had grounded the formation that morning. The original plan called for a dawn strike, simultaneous with Pearl Harbor, but the weather refused to cooperate. Hours ticked by. Japanese commanders paced the tarmac. Every passing minute increased the likelihood that the Americans would disperse their aircraft, get fighters airborne, mount a defense. By mid-morning, the fog finally lifted. The bombers launched. The flight from Formosa to Clark Field covered approximately 750 kilometers of open water, roughly a 2-hour journey at cruising speed. Every minute of that flight, Japanese pilots must have wondered, will they be ready for us? The answer, incredibly, was no. Despite 9 hours of warning since Pearl Harbor, despite explicit orders to disperse aircraft, the American planes at Clark Field were still lined up in neat rows along the runways when the Japanese formation arrived at 12:35 in the afternoon. 17 B-17 flying fortresses, dozens of P-40 Warhawk fighters, sitting on the ground like targets at a shooting gallery. The Japanese bombers approached at 20,000 feet, beyond the effective range of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped their payloads across the runways and facilities. The explosions ripped through hangars, cratered taxiways, and detonated fuel and ammunition stores. Then the Zero fighters swept in at treetop level, strafing everything that had survived the bombs. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines was effectively destroyed. Of 17 B-17s on the ground, 12 were wrecked beyond repair. Nearly every P-40 was reduced to burning wreckage. The few American fighters that managed to scramble arrived too late, finding only smoke and empty sky where the Japanese formation had already withdrawn northward. The Betty bombers returned to Formosa without a single loss, not one. Imagine you are an American pilot standing in that bomb shelter, watching the most advanced air base in the Western Pacific burn around you. The enemy just struck from over 700 kilometers away, a distance that seemed impossible for medium bombers. They flew higher than your guns could reach. They came and went before you could get a single plane airborne. And your Air Force, the one that was supposed to defend these islands, is now a field of smoking craters and twisted aluminum. That was the Betty bomber doing exactly what it was designed to do, operating beyond expected range, striking with surprise, departing before opposition could materialize. In conditions of limited fighter resistance, the aircraft was devastating. But 2 days later, the Betty would accomplish something even more extraordinary, something that would shake naval doctrine to its foundations and rewrite the rules of warfare at sea. December 10th, 1941, South China Sea, off the eastern coast of Malaya. A British naval task force designated Force Z was steaming northward, hunting for Japanese invasion convoys. At the heart of Force Z were 2 capital ships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, displacing 43,000 tons, one of the most modern warships in the Royal Navy, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, a veteran of the First World War that had been modernized in the 1930s. 4 destroyers completed the escort. The commander of Force Z, Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, had made a fateful decision. He had sailed without air cover. Phillips, a man shaped by decades of battleship-era thinking, doubted that aircraft could sink modern warships maneuvering at speed in open water. No active battleship had ever been sunk by air attack alone. Phillips believed his ship's anti-aircraft guns and armored hulls would provide sufficient protection. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted Force Z early that morning. The word went out to air bases in French Indochina, what we now call Vietnam. Bomber crews from the Kanoya, Genzan, and Mihoro air groups scrambled. These were elite units, specifically trained for anti-shipping operations, practiced in low-level torpedo runs at altitudes of less than 30 feet above the waves. The first wave, consisting of G-3M Nell bombers, found the British ships around 11:13 in the morning. Their high-level bombing scored a single hit on repulse, damaging but not critical. The British anti-aircraft fire was fierce. 5 of the 8 bombers took hits. 2 had to abort and return to base. Then the G-4M Bettys arrived. 26 Betty bombers, all armed with Type 91 aerial torpedoes, approached in coordinated waves. The Type 91 was the finest aerial torpedo in the world, an 840-kilogram weapon with a 205-kilogram warhead, designed to run true even in shallow coastal waters. Japanese torpedo crews had practiced their attack runs until the maneuvers were second nature. They came in low, barely above the wave tops, splitting into formations that attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Prince of Wales took the first torpedo hits. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the hull, flooding compartments faster than damage control teams could respond. The battleship's steering was damaged, her speed reduced, her ability to maneuver critically compromised. Repulse, under the brilliant ship handling of Captain William Tennant, initially evaded with extraordinary skill, dodging 19 torpedoes through aggressive maneuvering. But the Japanese split their final attack section to hit both flanks simultaneously, and Repulse could not dodge both. Torpedoes struck home on the port side, then more hits on the starboard. By 12:33 in the afternoon, Repulse rolled over and sank. Prince of Wales followed at approximately 1:20 p.m. 840 British sailors died. The engagement had lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in the history of naval warfare, capital ships actively defending themselves in open water had been sunk solely by air power. The age of the battleship, which had dominated naval strategy for half a century, ended that afternoon in the South China Sea, and the aircraft that delivered the killing blows was the Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber. Think about that for a moment. A medium bomber, lighter than an American B-25 Mitchell, with no armor, no protected fuel tanks, crewed by 7 men sitting in what was essentially a flying fuel tank, had just destroyed 2 of the most powerful warships in the British Empire. The aircraft's extraordinary range had allowed it to reach the battle zone from bases that the British considered safely distant. Its speed had allowed rapid attack runs. Its torpedo payload had delivered decisive damage. Every design choice that Honjo made in 1937, every kilogram of protection sacrificed for performance, had paid off spectacularly in the specific conditions of December 1941. Over the next 6 months, the pattern repeated across the Pacific. Betty bombers struck Darwin, Australia, from bases over 1,500 miles away, projecting Japanese air power to the southern edge of the Pacific Theater. They attacked Port Moresby in New Guinea from airfields across the island's mountain spine. They hit targets in the Philippines, Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, the Solomon Islands. Wherever the Japanese advance pushed forward, Betty bombers were there, striking targets at ranges that Allied commanders struggled to comprehend. The aircraft seemed unstoppable. It appeared from unexpected directions, struck with precision, and disappeared before fighters could intercept. The Betty became the symbol of Japanese air power's terrifying reach. For 6 months, it justified every assumption its designers had made. But there was a crack in the armor. Or rather, the complete absence of armor was about to become a crack in everything. The first warning sign came on February 20th, 1942. The 4th Kokutai, an elite Betty bomber unit freshly deployed to the captured airfield at Rabaul, launched 17 bombers to attack the American aircraft carrier USS Lexington. It was supposed to be another demonstration of the Betty's devastating anti-shipping capability. Instead, it became a preview of catastrophe. Wildcat fighters from Lexington's Combat Air Patrol intercepted the formation, and in the engagement that followed, the American pilots discovered something extraordinary. The Betty bombers exploded with astonishing ease. A short burst of .50 caliber fire anywhere near the wing roots produced immediate, catastrophic results. Fuel streaming from punctured tanks ignited instantly. The aluminum skin, thin as cardboard, provided zero protection. Aircraft after aircraft bloomed into orange fireballs and fell into the Pacific. Of 17 Betty bombers that launched from Rabaul that morning, only 2 returned. 15 were destroyed. Over 100 aircrewmen died in a single mission. The Lexington attack was not a battle. It was a massacre. But the true scale of the vulnerability would not reveal itself until the summer of 1942, when the United States Marines landed on a malaria-ridden island in the Solomon Chain, an island that would become a graveyard for Betty bomber crews, an island whose name would become synonymous with the most sustained aerial bloodletting of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal. Remember the assumptions that shaped the Betty's design? That fighter opposition would be limited, that the war would be short. That surprise would provide protection. By August 1942, every single one of those assumptions had collapsed. American industrial capacity was generating fighter aircraft at rates that Japanese planners never imagined possible. Wildcat fighters were being supplemented by faster, more capable Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training pipelines were producing skilled aviators in numbers that the Japanese simply could not match. Radar systems were providing early warning that eliminated the element of surprise, and the Betty bomber, designed for a world where these conditions did not exist, flew into this new reality and died. August 7, 1942. The 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, seizing the nearly completed Japanese airfield that would become Henderson Field. The Japanese response was immediate. Send the bombers from Rabaul. It was a 1,000-kilometer flight each way at the extreme edge of the Betty's operational range, but it was the only option. Betty bombers were the sole means of projecting meaningful strike capability from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. August 8, 27 Betty bombers, armed with aerial torpedoes and escorted by 15 Zero fighters, launched from Rabaul. Their mission: destroy the American amphibious shipping concentrated off Guadalcanal. They flew 4 hours over open ocean, burning fuel every minute before reaching the combat zone. American fighters were waiting. The Bettys came in low for their torpedo runs, skimming the wave tops at barely 100 feet. It was the same tactic that had destroyed Force Z 8 months earlier, but this time there were Wildcats overhead, and the Wildcats dove into the formation like wolves into a flock. The results were instantaneous and horrifying. Betty after Betty erupted into flames. The pilots had no warning, no time to react. A burst of fire from a Wildcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns would hit the wing area, and within seconds the entire aircraft was a torch. Some managed to release their torpedoes before dying. Most did not. The transport USS George F. Elliott was hit by a crashing Betty and caught fire, eventually becoming a total loss. The destroyer USS Jarvis took a torpedo hit, but the cost to the Japanese was staggering. Approximately 17 of the 27 Betty bombers were destroyed. Over 100 aircrewmen died. The damage to the American fleet was minimal compared to the catastrophic losses suffered by the attackers. And this was just the beginning. For the next 3 months, Betty bomber formations flew from Rabaul to Guadalcanal almost daily. And almost daily, American fighters slaughtered them. The regularity became grimly predictable. Around noon each day, what Marine pilots called Tojo time, formations of 20 to 40 Betty bombers would appear at 20,000 feet in perfect V formations. They would be met by Marines flying Wildcats who had developed specific tactics designed to exploit the Betty's fatal weakness. Major John L. Smith, commanding VMF 223, The 1st Marine Fighter Squadron at Henderson Field devised the technique that became standard doctrine. His pilots would climb ahead of and off to one side of the approaching bomber formation. When they were far enough ahead, the Wildcats would turn sharply to a course exactly opposite the Bettys, but 5,000 feet above them, roll inverted, and pull through into a steep diving attack. This maneuver placed the fighters outside the arc of the Betty's defensive guns, while giving perfect gunnery angles aimed directly at the wing fuel tanks. The results were devastating. Smith's pilots learned to aim for the wing roots, where the unprotected fuel tanks were most concentrated. A 2-second burst was usually enough. The fuel would ignite, the fire would spread along the wing in seconds, and the Betty would either explode in midair or spiral into the ocean, trailing a plume of flame and black smoke. Lieutenant Marion Carl, who would become the Marine Corps' first ace in the Pacific, described the experience in terms that every Betty crew member would have recognized from the other side. Hitting a Betty in the wing area was like touching a match to gasoline. There was no intermediate state. The aircraft was either untouched or it was on fire. And once on fire, the crew had seconds, not minutes, to get out. Most never did. By mid-November 1942, the aerial campaign over Guadalcanal had consumed the Japanese Navy's land-based air power. The best available estimates suggest that from August through November 1942, Japanese forces lost approximately 92 Betty bombers over the Solomons, 92 aircraft. With 7 crew members each, that represents roughly 644 trained aviators killed in 4 months, over a single island. The exchange rate was unsustainable by any calculation. Japan's pilot training program, which produced far fewer aviators than America's, could not replace losses at this rate. The experienced crews who had executed the stunning strikes of early 1942, the men who had sunk Prince of Wales and devastated Clark Field, were being consumed in a fire that the Betty's own design made inevitable. And the truly bitter irony? The Betty's extraordinary range, the very capability that its designers had sacrificed crew protection to achieve, was what made the Guadalcanal campaign so devastating. Because Rabaul was so far from Guadalcanal, over 1,000 kilometers, the Betty was the only Japanese aircraft with sufficient range to make the round trip. Shorter-ranged aircraft could not participate, so the Betty crews bore the full weight of the aerial campaign, flying the same lethal route day after day into the same gauntlet of American fighters, suffering the same catastrophic losses. The range that was supposed to be the Betty's greatest asset became the chain that bound its crews to a death sentence. But the losses at Guadalcanal were only the beginning of the reckoning, because even as Betty crews were burning over the Solomon Sea, the aircraft was about to play a role in one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations of the war, an operation that would demonstrate, with devastating finality, that there was no scenario in which a Betty bomber could survive once it came under determined attack, an operation that would cost Japan the most brilliant strategic mind it possessed. And it all started with a radio message that American code breakers intercepted on April 14th, 1943. Part 3. The Assassination and the Bloodletting. April 14th, 1943. A radio intercept station in the Pacific picked up a Japanese naval communication encoded in the JN-25D cipher. American cryptanalysts at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the legendary code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor, went to work. Within hours, they had decoded the message, and what it contained sent shockwaves through the American command structure. The message was an itinerary. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the most important military leader in Japan, was planning an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. The itinerary was detailed to the minute. Departure from Rabaul, 0600 hours, April 18th. Aircraft type, 2 G-4M Betty bombers. Escort, 6 Zero fighters. Route, Rabaul to Bougainville, approximately 315 miles. Estimated arrival at Balala Airfield, 0945 hours. The information climbed the chain of command with extraordinary speed. Admiral Chester Nimitz forwarded it to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who reportedly took it directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. The response, whether Roosevelt actually uttered these exact words or not, became legendary. Get Yamamoto. The mission was assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 18 aircraft were allocated, though 2 would drop out before the mission began, one with a blown tire on takeoff and another with drop tank fuel feed problems. The mission commander was Major John Mitchell, and the stakes could not have been higher. Here is what made this operation almost impossibly difficult. The P-38s would need to fly over 400 miles at wave-top altitude, no higher than 50 feet above the ocean, to avoid Japanese radar detection. They would navigate by dead reckoning and precise timing across open water with no landmarks. They would need to arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point, at exactly the calculated time, with a margin of error measured in minutes. Any deviation, any navigational error, any delay would mean Yamamoto's aircraft would land safely before they arrived. And here is where the Betty's story intersects with one of the most precisely executed military operations in history. Mitchell calculated the intercept time at 0935 hours, approximately 10 minutes before Yamamoto's expected landing. He plotted 4 precisely calculated flight legs, each with exact compass headings and time durations, curving far out over the Coral Sea to avoid detection before turning northwest toward Bougainville. His pilots would maintain strict radio silence for the entire flight. Navigation would depend entirely on Mitchell's calculations and his ability to hold exact air speeds and headings over more than 2 hours of ocean flying. At 0725 hours on April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the P-38 Lightnings took off from Guadalcanal. 16 aircraft formed up and headed south over the ocean, flying at 50 feet above the waves. For more than 2 hours, they saw nothing but water. Mitchell's navigation was flawless. At 0934 hours, 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, after more than 400 miles of dead reckoning navigation over open ocean, First Lieutenant Douglas Canning spotted them. 2 Betty bombers, flying low, with 6 Zero fighters stacked above as escort. Exactly as the decoded message had predicted. Exactly where Mitchell's calculations said they would be. The 4-aircraft killer flight, now reduced to 2 by the earlier dropouts, accelerated toward the bombers. Captain Thomas Lanfear and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from formation to engage, while the remaining P-38s climbed to hold off the Zero escort. What happened next took less than 60 seconds, and this is where the Betty's unprotected fuel tanks wrote the final sentence of Admiral Yamamoto's life. Barber closed on the lead Betty bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto, and opened fire. His .50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon poured rounds into the fuselage and wing area. The Betty, true to its reputation, responded exactly as thousands of American fighter pilots had learned to expect. The wing area ignited. Fire engulfed the left engine. The aircraft began to trail a dense plume of black smoke. There was no gradual deterioration, no struggling pilot fighting to maintain control while crew members battled flames. The Betty hit the wing's breaking point in seconds. The bomber plunged into the dense jungle of Bougainville, crashing through the canopy and coming to rest in pieces among the trees. Yamamoto's body was found the following day, still strapped to his seat, still clutching his katana. An autopsy revealed that he had been hit by 2.50 caliber rounds, one through the shoulder and one through the jaw, and was probably dead before the aircraft hit the ground. The second Betty, carrying Chief of Staff Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, was also hit and crash-landed in the ocean. Ugaki survived, one of only 4 survivors from the aircraft. Think about the bitter mathematics here. The most important admiral in Japan's war effort was traveling in an aircraft that his own military knew was catastrophically vulnerable to fighter attack. The Betty had been burning over Guadalcanal for 8 months by this point. Its vulnerability was not a secret, yet Yamamoto flew in it anyway, because there was no alternative. The Betty was the standard transport and bomber. It was what the Navy had, and what the Navy had was an aircraft that guaranteed any successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility that Yamamoto's bomber could survive once Barber's rounds found the unprotected fuel tanks. Not even the most skilled pilot, not even the most heroic defensive effort by the Zero escort, could change the fundamental reality engineered into the G4M's airframe. Hit the wing, and the aircraft dies. Always, without exception. The death of Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese morale, described by the historian Samuel Eliot Morison as equivalent to a major defeat in battle. But for the Betty and its crews, the loss was just one more data point in a loss curve that was climbing inexorably. Let me give you the numbers that tell the broader story, because statistics have a way of turning tragedy into abstraction, and I want you to feel the weight of what these numbers actually meant. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the 4th Kokutai, one of the premier Betty bomber units in the Japanese Navy, had been effectively destroyed as an operational force. Other units fared little better. The cumulative losses of the Solomons campaign, from August 1942 through February 1943, consumed experienced aircrew at a rate that Japanese training programs simply could not match. And the pattern did not stop. Throughout 1943, as American air superiority grew more complete, Betty losses continued to mount. Units were reconstituted with replacement crews, given a few weeks of training, and sent back into combat. These less experienced crews suffered even higher loss rates than their predecessors. By mid-1943, Japanese commanders began recognizing the obvious. The Betty could not survive in daylight against determined fighter opposition. Many units switched to night operations, where the cover of darkness provided the protection that the aircraft's designers had failed to build into its structure. But night bombing was far less accurate than daylight operations, and the strategic impact of Betty missions declined accordingly. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers were scrambling to fix the unfixable, starting with the 663rd aircraft. Produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath the wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise, a patch, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage from small caliber hits. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km per hour and maximum range by 315 kilometers. It did nothing for survivability in actual combat. The rubber sheets could slow leakage from rifle caliber rounds. They could not prevent fires from .50 caliber hits. They could not stop explosions when tracer rounds ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained exactly as Honjo had designed it 6 years earlier. Japanese crews knew the odds. They climbed into their Bettys knowing that any mission against American opposition could be their last. Not because of bad luck, but because of physics. The aircraft was a bomb waiting for a spark. And yet they flew, mission after mission, month after month, into conditions that guaranteed catastrophic losses. Why? Because there was nothing else. Japan's industrial base could not produce a replacement bomber in sufficient numbers. The Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga, intended as the Betty's successor, was plagued with production problems and never reached operational units in meaningful quantities before the war ended. The Betty, for all its flaws, was what the Navy had, and the Navy needed bombers. So men continued to die in an aircraft whose fundamental design guaranteed their deaths the moment an enemy fighter found them. That is not a tragedy of incompetence. It is a tragedy of mathematics. The numbers that defined the Betty's performance in 1937 became the numbers that defined its crew's death sentences from 1942 onward. Range equaled vulnerability. Performance equaled mortality. The equation that Honjo solved in Nagoya was written in blood across the skies of the Pacific. But even as the Betty's combat record compiled an ever longer list of losses, Japanese commanders found one more role for the aircraft, a role so desperate, so extreme, that it would represent the ultimate expression of the Betty's fatal flaw. a weapon that would turn the bomber into a delivery vehicle for something even more horrifying than unprotected fuel tanks. And on March 21st, 1945, that weapon would be used for the first time, with results that would shock even battle-hardened American sailors. Part 4. The Cherry Blossom and the Final Flights. The weapon was called the Oka. In Japanese, the word means cherry blossom. The Americans, with characteristic bluntness, called it the Baka bomb. Baka is Japanese for fool or idiot. Both names would prove appropriate. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka was a purpose-built, human-guided missile. Picture a small aircraft, barely large enough for one person, with stubby wooden wings and a 1,200-kilogram warhead in the nose. That is 2,646 pounds of high explosives, enough to destroy any ship it hit. 3 solid-fuel rocket motors in the tail could propel it to speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour in its terminal dive, faster than any Allied fighter, faster than any anti-aircraft system could track. At those speeds, it was effectively unstoppable once it began its final approach. But the Oka had a critical limitation. Its range was only 37 kilometers, less than 25 miles. The rocket motors burned for barely 10 seconds, which meant the Oka had to be carried to within striking distance of its target by a mothership. And the mothership chosen for this mission was the G-4M Betty bomber. Think about what this means. Take the most vulnerable bomber in the Pacific, an aircraft notorious for exploding from a few machine gun hits. Load a 1,200-kilogram suicide missile underneath it, adding enormous weight and drag. Reduce its speed and maneuverability to levels that made evasion virtually impossible, and then fly it directly toward the most heavily defended naval formation on Earth, an American carrier task force surrounded by rings of radar picket ships, combat air patrols, and hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. The Betty had to survive long enough to reach a release point roughly 25 miles from the target. At that distance, it would be well within the engagement range of every American fighter and anti-aircraft weapon in the fleet. The bomber would be slow, heavy, unable to maneuver, and on fire the instant any defensive weapon found it. The Oka program was born of desperation. By late 1944, conventional bombing attacks against American naval forces had become functionally suicidal. American air defenses were so complete that Japanese bombers attempting daylight strikes suffered near total losses. The Oka was intended to overcome these defenses by creating a weapon that was unstoppable in its final seconds. But it could only be unstoppable if it got close enough to launch. And getting close enough required the Betty to survive a gauntlet of fire that no Betty had ever survived before. March 21st, 1945, Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. 18 G-4M2E Betty bombers of the 711th Hikotai, 721st Kokutai, Jinrai, the Divine Thunder Unit, prepared for the first operational Oka mission in history. 15 of the Bettys carried Oka weapons beneath their fuselages. The remaining 3 carried conventional bomb loads. A fighter escort of approximately 30 Zero fighters accompanied the formation. The target was Task Group 58.1, an American carrier task force operating northwest of Okinawa. The formation launched in the late morning and headed south toward the American fleet. Each Betty carrying an Oka weapon was significantly heavier and slower than normal. The additional 1,200-kilogram weapon, plus its mounting hardware creating drag, that reduced airspeed and eliminated any possibility of evasive maneuvering. The Oka pilots sat inside their tiny aircraft, sealed into their cockpits from the outside, waiting in the bomb bay darkness for the order to release. American radar detected the incoming formation at approximately 100 miles distance, far beyond the Oka's maximum release range. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it could close to Oka launch distance. What followed was less a battle than an execution. The Betty bombers, heavy, slow, unable to maneuver while carrying the Oka weapons, were virtually helpless against the Hellcats. The escort Zeros fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. One by one, the Hellcats tore into the Betty formation. The The results were immediate and familiar. Hit a Betty, and it burns. Hit a Betty carrying an Oka, and it burns spectacularly, sometimes detonating the missile's warhead in mid-air, creating an explosion visible for miles. Some Betty crews, realizing they could never reach launch range, jettisoned their Oka weapons into the sea in a desperate attempt to gain enough speed and maneuverability to escape. It did not help. The Hellcat pilots were thorough and relentless. Within 20 minutes, every single one of the 18 Betty bombers had been destroyed. Not a single aircraft survived to reach the fleet. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against an American ship. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Oka pilots died. The first operational Oka mission was a total, absolute, catastrophic failure. Let that number sink in. 152 men died in 20 minutes without inflicting any damage whatsoever on the enemy. The mission failed not because the Oka weapon was ineffective. At 650 kilometers per hour with a 1,200 kilogram warhead, it was terrifying. The mission failed because the delivery vehicle could not survive long enough to reach launch range. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks, the same design choice made in a Nagoya drafting room 8 years earlier, ensured that the Oka would never get close enough to prove its lethality. The Japanese tried again. On April 12, 1945, another Oka mission launched against American ships off Okinawa. This time, some Bettys managed to reach launch range. The destroyer USS Manert El Abele was struck by an Oka and broke in two, becoming the first ship sunk by the weapon. The destroyer USS Stanley was struck by another Oka that passed completely through the hull above the waterline, its warhead exiting the other side and detonating in the water. Stanley survived with minimal damage, but even in these successful attacks, the cost was enormous. Most of the Betty bombers launching Oka weapons were destroyed before, during, or shortly after release. Of the approximately 300 Oka weapons available for the Okinawa campaign, only 74 were actually committed to operations. Of those, 56 were either destroyed with their parent aircraft or lost during attacks. Post-war analysis concluded that the Oka's strategic impact was negligible. No major warships were sunk by Oka attacks. The weapon that was supposed to turn the tide of the naval war off Okinawa had been neutralized by the fundamental vulnerability of the aircraft that carried it. The Betty's design flaw, accepted as a reasonable trade in 1937, had now cascaded through 8 years of war into its most extreme consequence. An aircraft designed to sacrifice crew protection for range was now being used to carry suicide weapons that required surviving to a specific range threshold. The very quality that the Betty lacked, the ability to absorb damage and keep flying, was the one quality it needed most for this mission. The circle of failure was complete. But even as the Oka missions consumed the last of Japan's Betty bomber crews in a fury of fire and sacrifice, the aircraft had one final role to play. And it was a role that no one who had watched Betty's burn over Guadalcanal or die in flames over Okinawa could have predicted. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation by radio, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Allied surrender terms. The war was over. 4 days later, on August 19th, 2 G-4M Betty bombers sat on the tarmac at Aeshima Airfield. But these Bettys looked like no G-4M anyone had ever seen. They were painted white from nose to tail. Green crosses, the international symbol of peace, replaced the red circle of the rising sun on every surface, wings, fuselage, and tail. They carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military cargo of any kind beyond what was necessary for flight. Their crews wore dress uniforms instead of flight suits, and they carried passengers, the official Japanese surrender delegation, bound for Manila to negotiate the formal terms of Japan's capitulation. The aircraft were given call signs chosen by General Douglas MacArthur himself, Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. The names were deliberate. Bataan, the peninsula in the Philippines, where American and Filipino forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, enduring the infamous death march that killed thousands. Now, 3 years later, Aircraft named for that humiliation carried Japan's own surrender delegation. One of the aircraft was a G6M1L2, a transport variant converted from the bomber airframe. The other was a disarmed G4M1. Both retained the Betty's distinctive cigar-shaped fuselage, the same shape that had earned the aircraft its nicknames, the same shape that American fighter pilots had learned to recognize as the easiest kill in Pacific skies. P-38 Lightning fighters, the same type of aircraft that had killed Yamamoto, escorted the White Bettys throughout their flight. The escort was both protective and supervisory, ensuring safe passage while preventing any deviation from the prescribed route. The flight from Japan to Aoshima covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range even in its most reduced configuration. At Aoshima, the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 transport for the final leg to Manila. The White Bettys were photographed, documented, and then, according to most accounts, scrapped shortly afterward. The symbolism was inescapable and the circle complete. The aircraft that had destroyed American air power at Clark Field on the first day of the Pacific War now carried Japan's admission of defeat on one of the last. The bomber that had sunk British battleships, projected Japanese power across half the Pacific Ocean, and carried Admiral Yamamoto to his death, ended its service painted in the colors of surrender. But there is one more piece of this story, one more scene that brings us back to where we began, back to Major McCoy and that pristine Betty bomber on the tarmac at Clark Field. Because the examination of tail number 763-12 was not just a technical exercise, it was the moment when the full truth of the Betty's design philosophy became clear, documented in black and white for military engineers on both sides of the Pacific to study for decades to come. And the verdict of that examination answered a question that had haunted American pilots since the first time they watched a Betty explode into a fireball from a 3-second burst of .50 caliber fire. Part 5 plus verdict. The final audit. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling tail number 763-12. 3 weeks of careful documentation, measurement, and analysis. The report they produced, classified secret and distributed to Allied air forces worldwide, laid bare the complete engineering story of the G4M Betty bomber. The numbers told a story of deliberate choice. Empty weight, 6,741 kilograms. For a bomber of this size, with a 25-meter wingspan and a 20-meter fuselage, that weight was astonishingly low. By comparison, the American B-25 Mitchell, a roughly similar-sized medium bomber, had an empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms. That 2,300 kilogram difference represented a missing element that McCoy's engineers could identify with precision. The B-25 carried armor plating around crew positions, self-sealing fuel tanks with layered rubber compounds, fire suppression systems, and redundant safety measures. The Betty carried none of these. The fuel system was particularly revealing. 8 tanks, arranged in 4 pairs within the wings, held 4,780 liters of aviation gasoline. The tanks were positioned in the thickest section of the wing, where the wing joined the fuselage, maximizing fuel capacity by utilizing the available structural volume. But this placement also positioned the fuel directly in the line of fire during any attack from the side or below, which is to say, during any fighter attack from any angle that a combat pilot would actually use. The aluminum skin of the wing, approximately 2 millimeters thick, provided zero ballistic protection. McCoy's team calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. 500 kilograms that translated directly into 625 additional liters of fuel, extending the aircraft's range by hundreds of kilometers. The math was elegant. The cost was measured in human lives. American wartime studies had demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection with statistical clarity that left no room for debate. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by margins of 3 to 4 times compared to unprotected systems. Body armor reduced fatalities from chest wounds by more than 75%. Armored crew positions dramatically improved survival rates in damaged aircraft. Protected fuel systems allowed bombers to absorb significant battle damage and return home, preserving both the aircraft and, more importantly, the experienced crew who could fly the next mission. The American approach reflected a doctrine that trained aircrews represented a strategic asset more valuable than the aircraft itself. A B-17 or B-24 could be built in weeks. An experienced combat crew, the pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunners who had survived multiple missions and accumulated irreplaceable knowledge, took months or years to develop. American industrial capacity could replace aircraft almost indefinitely. Experienced combat veterans could not be manufactured. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that mission accomplishment outweighed individual crew survival. The aircraft existed to deliver weapons to targets. Crew protection was a luxury that degraded the aircraft's ability to fulfill that mission. If crews were lost, new crews could be trained, except they could not fast enough. And this is where the design philosophy collapsed. Japan's pilot training program produced far fewer aviators than America's. The initial cadre of highly skilled, experienced pilots who had trained for years before the war were irreplaceable once lost. The Betty's vulnerability meant that experienced crews were being consumed at rates that training could not match. Each lost crew took with them hundreds of flight hours of accumulated skill, knowledge of enemy tactics, expertise in navigation, torpedo attack coordination, and formation flying. These losses degraded the combat effectiveness of surviving units, as veteran leaders were replaced by less experienced replacements who suffered even higher loss rates. The result was a death spiral. Losses degraded quality. Degraded quality increased losses further degraded quality. By 1944, Betty bomber units were flying missions with crews who had a fraction of the training and experience that their predecessors possessed. These crews died at even higher rates, accelerating the spiral. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field documented the physical evidence of a design philosophy that had consumed itself. The fuel tanks were not an oversight. They were a deliberate choice made by engineers who understood the risks, who calculated the vulnerabilities, who accepted the trade-offs because they believed performance would prove decisive. They were brilliant engineers making a rational decision within the constraints they were given. The Navy demanded range. Honjo delivered range. The specifications were met. The aircraft performed exactly as designed. The fuel tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving the required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the assumptions of 1937. But those assumptions were wrong. The war was not short. Fighter opposition was not limited. Surprise could not be maintained indefinitely. And once the assumptions collapsed, the design choice that enabled the Betty's extraordinary capabilities became the design choice that killed its crews. Let me give you the final accounting. Total production of all G4M variants, approximately 2,435 aircraft, making it one of the most produced Japanese bombers of the war. These aircraft served in every major campaign of the Pacific War, from the first day to the last. They operated across distances spanning from Australia to the Aleutians, from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific. Few survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that the unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, only a handful of operational Bettys remained. An aircraft type that had numbered in the hundreds in 1942 had been ground to near extinction by attrition that no amount of production could replace. The human cost is harder to quantify with precision, but the scale is unmistakable. Thousands of Japanese aircrewmen died in Betty bombers during the Pacific War. Each crew numbered 7 men. At a rough estimate of total combat losses exceeding 1,500 aircraft, the death toll approaches or exceeds 10,000 aviators. Many of these men died in fires that lasted seconds, immolated in aircraft that offered no protection and no hope of survival once damage occurred. The crew of tail number 763-12, the bomber that McCoy examined, had survived by walking away from their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field. They had abandoned an intact bomber and disappeared into the Philippine jungle. In doing so, they achieved something that most Betty crews never could. They survived, not because of the aircraft's design, but despite it. They lived because they never flew that particular aircraft into combat. The Betty bomber's story is, at its core, a story about the price of capability purchased without protection, about what happens when performance requirements override survivability considerations, about the gap between what an aircraft can do on paper and what it can do in combat. The extraordinary range of 6,000 kilometers meant nothing when the aircraft could not survive the final 100 kilometers to target. The impressive speed of 428 kilometers per hour meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases, vectored by radar that eliminated surprise. The payload capacity of 800 kilograms was irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapons could be released. The Betty could reach farther than any bomber in the world. It just could not survive the reaching. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the air war in the Pacific. Not because Japanese engineers lacked brilliance. They designed an aircraft that met every specification they were given. Not because Japanese pilots lacked courage. They flew into certain death with a discipline that earned the respect of their enemies. Not because Japanese industry lacked capability. They produced nearly 2,500 of these aircraft under increasingly difficult wartime conditions. Japan lost the air war because it designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost, while America designed aircraft to bring crews home. The nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely, replacing losses, accumulating experience, growing stronger with every month of combat. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that consumed itself through attrition, losing experienced crews faster than they could be replaced, growing weaker even as the enemy grew stronger. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy in January 1945 were not an accident. They were not a failure. They were a decision that made perfect sense in 1937 and catastrophic sense by 1942, a decision that purchased extraordinary capability at a price measured in thousands of lives, a decision whose consequences burned across the Pacific sky for 4 years, leaving trails of flame and smoke that marked the difference between two fundamentally different answers to the same question. What is an aircraft for? American designers answered, to bring our crews home alive so they can fight again tomorrow. Japanese designers answered, to reach the target, regardless of what that costs. Both answers were honest, both were rational within their assumptions, but only one was sustainable. And the proof was written in the loss statistics of the G4M Betty bomber, the magnificent aircraft that asked its crews to die for its range. They flew it because they were ordered to fly it. They died in it because, in the end, that was what it was designed to make them do. The crew of tail number 763-12 walked away from their bomber on a tropical airfield in the Philippines. Most Betty crews were never that fortunate. Their final flights ended in fire over the vast Pacific, in jungles of distant islands, in the cold waters of the Solomon Sea. They climbed into unprotected aircraft, flew across thousands of kilometers of ocean, and paid the price that had been calculated in a Nagoya drafting room before any of them had ever put on a uniform. The Betty bomber served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field. It closed the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white paint and green crosses. Between those two flights, it killed more of its own crews than perhaps any other aircraft in the history of military aviation. And it all started with a decision about fuel tanks.